Alright, this is FYNDR with a new video. As promised at the end of the Zenith Hunter video walkthrough, I'm going through and setting up another save hacking guide similar to what was done for the last pikeman. So for this video we'll be exploring the save system within Zenith Hunter, how the data is stored, and what we can do to manipulate it. So for now, let's click continue. And these are just some save files that I have set up on my local machine. We probably won't touch on all of them since it's fairly straightforward to illustrate the effects of the save file manipulation through just one of these. But these basically cover the three ending conditions, which is for the save slot 1 that you've completely beaten the game, the second save slot that you've beaten the game once and have made it to the end, and then the third save, which is just you've beaten the game the first time and are just hitting the ending. But in terms of where the save data is stored, I'll just bring up this view. Basically, for GameMaker games, using the current version, it stores everything under your local app data, in this case under a Zenith Hunter directory. And there are .ini files for the 3 save slots, and then there's a settings file which is used for storing any control changes or any graphical settings like the VSync or the screen size would be stored there. So really all we're worried about is the actual save file format. So I'm going to just bring that up. And I have each of the save files listed here. We're going to start with just the normal save file for when you first get to the end of the game. And you'll notice that this is in the same format as in the last pikeman. The fields, I think, aren't really stored in any particular order, but it's all stored within this data section, and then there are calls within the game code that can read through this file. So starting from the top, I'm just going to explain what these fields do. Deaths is a pretty simple one. It's the number of deaths that you get during the game. And for this field, it's not really, there's no protection around it, really. So you could manipulate this value and set it to 0 if you want. And the reason for that is just because the number of deaths is more of a bragging rights statistic than anything that actually affects the gameplay. So I figured if someone was motivated enough to get into the save file and lower the number of deaths that they have, then that's just fine by me. It doesn't really impact their gaming experience. But for the other fields, I went with a more rigorous approach. So you'll notice these are all listed as passwords, and that's because these essentially are unique strings that correspond to values internally. These are all 16 character long alphabetic strings, and it's just all caps because it's easier to deal with. But they're entirely random and unique, and internally in the game code, it uses these passwords to look up corresponding values for each of these different attributes. So for example, the gold, there are up to 6 gold pieces in the game, and so the number 6 as it pertains to gold corresponds to this password and vice versa. And so if you tried to put in a value that isn't this, in the vast majority of cases, it would be an invalid password and it would be rejected, which we'll see how that works soon. But there are a handful of other cases where you can put in a correct and valid password and get a proper gold value out. Like I said, this is for the maximum amount of gold. I don't know why you'd want to have less, but you could if you knew the password. And the other 3 fields are in the same vein. Deeds are in reference to a specific set of circumstances where throughout the game you're given the opportunity to assist NPCs. I believe there was the green guy that was stuck in an avalanche on level 2. On level 3, there was the indigo guy who was about to fall off a cliff. And then in level 4, there was the pink guy who was stuck in a block of ice. So for each of those, that increments a deeds counter. And then on the very last level, if you've maxed out your deeds and you have a boss fight against the indigo guy, instead of defeating him and killing him, you defeat him and spare his life, and in exchange he gives you the last piece of gold. So these two together are used to control basically what ending you get. And so both of them are sensitive information and they're password protected. In a similar vein, the health password indicates how much health you have. So right now it's at the max of 6 because you get 2 throughout normal gameplay if you do some special things, and then automatically you get 1 extra at the very last stage. And since it's not something you want people to be able to just change on the fly, that's also password protected. And then finally the level password. So of all the stats, this is the one that has the most possible values. I think there are 25 or so levels total. I guess a few more if you consider the endings and all that. But yeah, as you transition to the next level, it saves a new password under here and keeps track of your progress that way. In this case, I believe this is the password for the Zenith. So that is all good. And actually, let me go to the next save file. Again, these aren't really in any order. This is after having beaten the game once and then making it back to the end. But as soon as you beat the game and you get the alternate ending where you pick up the silver medal, you go to the true Zenith, it sets this masochist mode flag. And what that means is basically you're playing through the hard mode where you only have 1 hit point. And it uses this flag to determine whether or not to display the silver medal in the continue screen. And the other thing of note is that the health password is set to this value, which means that you only have an HP of 1. The only way that you would get this value put in here is if you actually beat the game once. There isn't a way to go from the default 3 health just down to 1 unless you fulfill that condition or you manually entered this password. So that is important to know. And then for the third file, it's pretty much the same, except that the masochist mode is set to the gold medal value. So the save file will display both the silver and the gold medal, and then the level password is actually set to the credits, and that's just to prevent complications with incrementing these various counters. And it basically signifies that the game has been entirely completed, and there's nothing further to do with it. But in any case, now that we've gone over all that, we'll take a look at what password protections there are. So you could conceivably change these values to other valid numbers or passwords that correspond to numbers internally, and you could set whatever number of gold, deeds, or health you want, and certain levels. Of course, right now everything is set to the last level and their max values, so there isn't really any reason to change these to a valid password. But there are certain things that are being done behind the scenes to validate these passwords and these fields generally. So actually, if I go in here, and let's say I change the number of deaths to, I'm just going to set it to 0. So it'll honor that value and say that I've had 0 deaths in this file, and that's fine. But let's say that I was trying to set the password for gold, and we'll just set it as gold, which is not a valid password. We'll set the number of deeds to deed and the health to health. I'm going to leave the level password alone for the time being, but I've saved the values, and then I'm going to go over to the game. And it hasn't loaded it up, but if I go back and hit continue, you'll see a few things here. So the deaths were correctly set to 0. The gold was not a valid value, and so it was set to 0. Same with the deeds, although that's not something that's inherently visible. And if I load the file, I see I have 3 hit points instead of the 6 that I had before, because I put an invalid value in. And if I pause, it says that I have all the treasures because I'm on the last level, but I don't have any of the gold listed. So, and then if we go back to the save file, it says it's been modified by another program, and we reload it. And you'll see that it put in the values, the default values for each of these fields. So the gold is set to 0, that's the password for 0. The deeds are set to 0 as well, and the health is set to 3. So that's great. Now if we go to this save instead, let's just leave all these values as is for now. And I will hop over to here. And it says I have 1 hit point, I have all the gold. So if I go up here, we can go through the final alternate ending, which I won't go through the whole thing. I'm just going to illustrate something very quickly. So if I go up here under normal circumstances, I talk to the person at the top of the True Zenith, and he thinks that I beat the game once, and this will be my second time beating it. As soon as I take that medal, it sets the masochist mode flag to 2 with the correct password, and saves it so that I continue from the credit screen. So that's all fine and good. But let's say I were to go in here, and instead of having the health set to 1, I'm going to reset it to the default value of 3, which actually I'm just going to copy from here. Because let's say you wanted to play the game through with more than 1 health for the extra hard mode. So everything else is the same. The game thinks that you've gone through, gotten all the gold, done all the deeds, and did it with the masochist mode flag set. But you'll see that we have 3 hit points. Now if we go to the True Zenith, which will be in a second here. Okay, so now if you talk to the guy here, he realizes that there's a mismatch here. So there's a check in the code that makes sure that you have the masochist mode set, which means you have the silver medal, and you only have 1 hit point. In this case, the game pretty much calls you out, and that's that. So you can't actually progress from this point. So you'd have to reset the value back to 1 somehow, or otherwise take care of that. So there are ways around that by basically saving passwords and that sort of thing, but in general, this system isn't that rife for abuse. So I'm just going to reload that. Okay, so then one last piece that I wanted to cover. We've manipulated all of the fields, the masochist mode flag, the other password fields, and deaths, but not the level password. So we're on the last level anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But let's say that you had a completely new file and you wanted to try to find passwords that led you to the last level. And I'm going to put one that's clearly not correct. And then I'm going to load this file up. Now, what this will actually do is take the user to a fake level, which in turn leads to a screen that's something of an Easter egg. I will say it's meant to be sort of a startling thing, but we'll see when we get there. So the first thing is the music's different, of course, and it says you have all the treasures, which is fine. But if I try to move forward here, okay, so basically it takes you to a, it simulates a system failure and takes you to a black screen and goes to a jump scare. And the game tells you to get out, and then it closes itself prematurely. And then if we reload the save file, we'll see that the level password has been set to just the word hack over and over, indicating that that was an invalid save. So that's sort of a special case. The others are a little more benign in what they do by just resetting to your default values or back to 0 or what have you. But yeah, so in terms of the security, it's decent enough for the purpose that it has, I think. And it's a decent system that combines the strength of having passwords with the convenience of having safe slots. So in general, I think it's a pretty good system. And I managed to take advantage of the fact that there's this save file in the back end that can be tweaked to find some secrets in the game. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed sort of an explanation of how the save system works. In terms of new videos, just because there's holidays and other obligations coming up, I am not sure if I'll be able to get any done the rest of this year, but I should have something out sometime in 2019, sometime. So anyway, until then.